Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on this webinar. This is part 3 of the series. So to kick us off, I'm going to go over some housekeeping. All participants are muted in this webinar just to keep everything flowing accordingly. For any technical issues, use the chat function. So you can see that there on the side there, just use that. For any questions, you can send through the chat/question box, so you'll see those as well. So send in any questions to think of along the way, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. A recording of this webinar will be sent to all the registrants within 24 hours of this webinar is finished. So if you missed anything, you want to go back and review anything, that will be sent out in 24 hours for everyone. The traditional land acknowledgement. Eco-Canada and myself would like to recognize today and every day the land we are on. Eco-Canada is committed to reconciliation, starts with acknowledging our honor and privilege to live and work within this Indigenous territory. Eco-Canada acknowledges the traditional territories and the oral practices of these Indigenous nations. So about us, who is ECO? Eco-Canada is a steward of the Canadian environmental workforce across all industries. We champion end-to-end career of an environmental professional. We not only train and certify professionals, but we also help identify and address labor market gaps. Our efforts promote and drive responsible, sustainable economic growth to ensure that environmental care and best practices are a priority. Now I'm going to hand this off to Stephanie. Stephanie, you want to get us started?
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Chase, and thanks, Eco-Canada, for having me back. So today I kind of want to chat with you guys about risk. And so today's topic is going to be primarily around the introduction to risk and some basic risk methodologies, and it's going to be tailored a little bit more to sort of an environmental mindset. Chase, are you able to pop up that PowerPoint?
Yep, it's up right now.
Okay, I can't just see it on my side. Sorry about that.
Sorry, 1 second.
So first off, let's
I just bugged out there for a second. Sorry about that.
No worries.
There we go.
Perfect. So first off, I think it's always great when you're talking about risk, sort of what do we mean by risk in this context? In this particular instance, we're going to sort of define risk as something that's undesirable, something that has uncertainty on effects or implications. And generally speaking, we regard them as being negative towards our health, any sort of well-being initiatives, our property, the environment, financials, and things like that. So we generally view risk as a negative consequence, outcome, or likelihood. And as we define risk in the context of environmental management, I think the EPA did a really excellent job defining it for environmental users, which is the chance of harmful effects to human health or ecological systems as a result of an environmental exposure to environmental stressors. So those stressors can be physical, those could be chemical or biological, and they can introduce or cause an adverse effect in humans or the ecosystem. And so why is this important? So this is really important because we need to be assessing and managing risks on environmental projects and programs and within operational groups. So this becomes a really important to document and address ideally all aspects of that particular operation or project program. And you want to review those on a regular basis. You want to monitor them. You want to take a look at any of the mitigations you've put in place to see if they've worked effectively, or maybe they're not effective and you actually have to do something else. So we really want to make sure that you have sufficient resources to do any of these jobs effectively. So risk management does require resources, whether that's time, people, both. And any results of any sort of analysis or risk review needs to be communicated effectively through a system, generally cloud-based, and that those risk management recommendations are implemented and again, you want to put those into a system so that you can measure and monitor your progress to be successful. So I just think it's really important we start off with some definitions first as we kind of get into the weeds. Now, the next slide here, we're going to talk about different types of risks, because I think it's really important to talk about generally all the different types that we could sort of run into. Chase, if you would just advance the slide one, that would be great. Awesome. So the generally, I guess the general headers for risk that we like to use are political, economic, social, technical, environmental, and legal. And it forms a cute little acronym called PESTLE, which is helpful in remembering it, you know, if you for posterity, I suppose. So when we talk about political risk is uncertainty as it relates to, say, a municipal in our country, provincial or federal levels of political instability. So globally this year, roughly 50% of the world's population is going to the polls, which means they're voting in a new federal government in their respective countries. So that's a huge political risk, because the world's going to change, policies are going to change, how people get along or don't get along are going to change between nations. So that's an example of political risk. Economic risk generally is at a larger scale. So economic risk are things like inflation. So if our inflation has gone up 14% in the last year on food, that's a continuation of inflationary risk on an economic scale. Also, the lending rates by major financial institutions are an economic risk that drives a lot of behavior at a corporate level or a lot of spending at a consumer level. So if bank rates go up really high, we have impacts to the housing market. If bank rates are really low, we have, you know, for example, more spending in the housing market. So that's just one example of how economic factors would impact major financial institutions. Pardon me. The next one would be social. Now, social is anything that really impacts people on a typically person to person or community level. So a good example of this is the public backlash on some prominent social issues, prompting some new laws like the Modern Slavery Act. So that's Bill S211. So, you know, what happens there is we get a bunch of news media around, you know, children in other countries fabricating something, or putting food together in other countries, and we receive those items, and that backlash, that outcry of children being enslaved has precipitated in many nations, the EU, the US, Canada, etc., in developing and institutionalizing some regulations and laws around slavery. So that would be a very specific type of social risk. Technical risks, really big in the media right now, are things around AI, what AI does, what can it do, can it manipulate, can it change things, all that kind of stuff. So those would be another example of technical risks and opportunities. Now, environmental, there's a number of different types of environmental risks that people like to focus on. So one is natural hazards and environmental risks. So these are things like floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, natural occurring items that we are anticipating could potentially happen, but maybe the scale or the depth and breadth. For example, fires in Alberta this year are expected to be at an all-time high. So that would be an enhanced natural risk for this 2024 season. Anthropogenic risks. So these are things like pollution and contaminants. So soil contaminants, air contaminants, things along those lines. And then emerging risks. So emerging risks in the environment are climate change impacts, maybe types of unanticipated erosion due to a natural disaster, or an invasive species like the introduction of a fish or a bug or a plant that is invasive to wherever it's been introduced. So a little bit of a heavier focus there on the environmental risks, and they're different depending on, of course, the type and the nature. Legal risks. So legal risks, a good example for you guys would be the Security and Exchange Commission, or the SEC in the US, now has specific reportings and laws around ESG reporting. So if you fabricate your ESG report, you can get in a lot of trouble. You can get fines. You can, be pulled from the stock exchange. A number of things could occur there. Another one under legal would be rules and laws around reporting, like your accounting reporting, like under IFRS, or the International Financial Reporting Standards, and the greenhouse gas reporting protocols. So those would be things that you have to do them a certain way, or there's fairly serious consequences. So those are different types of risks. So I'm going to get Chase here to pop in a quick poll for you guys, to see what do you do in your current role? Do you deal with any of these types of risks in your current role? So everything that we just went through in the last slide, if you could select yes, you do identify and categorize risks in your role. No, you don't, or that's not applicable where you're at right now. So if you just take 2 secs and fill out that poll for me, that would be great. I'll just give it a couple minutes here. How are we doing, Chase? We have
Yeah, we're
have any
doing
results yet?
75% say yes, 18% saying no, and then 12% are saying not applicable. So it's kind of bouncing around a little bit, but
Oh,
pretty much
wow.
sticking to those numbers. Yeah.
Okay, great. So the majority of people on the call identify risks in their current role. So that's great. Excellent to know. So now we're going to zip into some assessment methods. So if we can just advance the slide one, that would be great. So some basic risk assessments that we're probably going to do in the environmental space are kind of, I'm going to bucket them into qualitative versus quantitative, root cause, and then hazard identification, which also includes exposure assessment or consequence analysis. So these types of risk assessment methods are really important to understand what the right one is to use, or what combination is to use when you're understanding your particular risk. So not all assessment methods are created equal, and depending on the type of risk that you're working through, you might want to select different assessment methods. So when we get to a couple more slides, we're going to talk about 2 specific case studies, and it would be really great if you can think about what risk assessment method you would use in this particular incident when we get to the case studies. And you can say, oh, I think this qualitative would work really well here, or maybe a root cause or hazard identification, etc. So these would be just a quick snapshot. So qualitative versus quantitative, that's very numbers versus subjectivity, right? So I'm either going to do it all based on math, which would be quantitative, or quality based is going to be, how does it feel? How does it look? And it's not going to necessarily have as much hard data around it. Root cause analysis, you've probably also heard of like a taproot analysis, or a fishbone diagram, or 5 whys. And so those types of analysis is really try and get down to like what truly is the root cause. And usually those ones end up being, that's a behavior that somebody personally has. That's a fundamental like training gap. That's a environmental condition that was unplanned for. Like, so it gets down to like a really nitty gritty singular item for a root cause analysis. Hazard identification is really quite excellent for things like pollution. Is identifying the hazard, what it is, what it could do, what are the elements there. Exposure assessment, over time, what does that exposure lead to? What are the likely outcomes, percentages? What are the known outcomes based on, say, maybe science or medical information? And then consequence analysis, and that's usually, again, quite a bit based on percentages, right? So what is the consequence of this? Well, we have and we'll get into a really good example of that. Well, we have a 21% likelihood that this is going to occur, or there's a 18% likelihood that this would occur as a consequence analysis piece. So thinking about those risk assessment methods, we're going to get into some strategies. So now that we've identified our risk and we've assessed our risk, we're going to move into the next slide, which is what's our strategy for now dealing with that? So we know that there's a 20% likelihood that this bad thing's going to happen. What do we want to do? So this is, I also want you guys to think about some questions here in terms of how you would layer on different risk management strategies based on some of the case studies. So in our first one is risk mitigation. So we have a 20% likelihood that this bad thing is going to happen, and now we want to mitigate it. So in order to mitigate it, we're going to do something that's preventative. So if I have a 20% likelihood somebody's going to drive their company vehicle inappropriately, and I need to, not have that happen. I need them to drive their vehicle, with less than a 1% likelihood that's going to be driven inappropriately. Maybe I put in a sensor system. Maybe I put in a telematics system into that vehicle to monitor their driving behavior. Maybe I'm going to have standard operating procedures or procedures that they have to follow in order to drive that vehicle. So I'm going to put in and I'm going to layer in preventative measures, controls. So that can include anything from physical devices to rules and procedures. The next one is risk transfer. So risk transfer, the most common ones that you're probably all going to be really familiar with are things like insurance, contracting somebody and transferring a portion of the risk to them under contract, or liability sharing. So a really good example of this is your car insurance, right? So if you total your vehicle, you paid your, $100 a month in insurance, and if that happens, you get a net new vehicle. Maybe it doesn't always quite work out exactly the way that you'd want, but the liability of having to go and buy a brand new vehicle isn't left to you. Your insurance company goes and takes care of that, and so they take on the risk to replace your vehicle, and that's why you have premiums. So that's just a really simple example of risk transfer. And so then there's risk acceptance. So these are things that you can't do anything about. And there are ways to deal with really big risks. Like I live in a hurricane location, so I live in the Gulf of Mexico. I live maybe in Houston, and I can't get hurricane insurance because there's 5 hurricanes there a year. So there are ways to use a different mechanism where you basically self-insure, and you have a vehicle that allows you to do that, and basically you put money in and you self-insure in the event that there's a catastrophic event. However, in most places who don't self-insure, you're just taking on the risk that if something happens, you're going to cover those costs or that downtime or any of those impacts. The problem that we have when we accept risk and we don't understand the total magnitude of it is it can really impact the company's ability to continue to operate. So these are ones that you really want to use a variety of different risk assessment methods, maybe 2 or 3 even assessment methods, to make sure you're really getting all the risk details out when you're accepting risk. So now that we've talked about our assessment methods, we understand our strategies, the key next piece is communication. And so if we move to the next slide, this is where we talk about stakeholder and community engagement. So it's super important that as you move through this process with risk, you engage your stakeholders, your communities, and other people that potentially are impacted. If you don't do that, you miss out on a huge feedback loop that you potentially might miss some other risks that you didn't contemplate originally. So this is probably the most critical step in your risk assessment, is after you've gone through your initial assessment, you've done your mitigations perhaps, then you say, hey, we've identified these items, here's some of the risk treatment we're going to apply, and we're going to engage our community and get feedback on that. It is super important that you have really great transparent communication with your stakeholders. That authenticity of the communication, the timeliness, and the sufficient context and details really helps move through any of these major risks. And then when you talk about actually having an incident, having this community engagement really actually helps with the resolution of it, and helps keep a lot of the temperatures down when you actually do have a major incident. that needs to be reviewed, and we'll get into some case studies around that. So when we use an engagement process to solicit and incorporate feedback into your operation, you end up actually with a better risk management plan, and you end up with way better outcomes. So it's really important that we think about that. So now what I'd like to do with you guys is I'd like to dip into 2 case studies. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the case study, and then I would really like you guys to engage and ask some questions, but I'd also like you to think about, what type of assessment tools do you think would work well, given what we talked about? So those would be like qualitative versus quantitative, root cause, hazard identification, exposure assessments, consequence. And I'd like you to sort of see, what would you do in that particular incident? So we're going to move over to the next slide now, which is case studies. So in case studies, the first one I want to talk to you about is Cardell paper. So Cardell paper discharged, we had a new line of paper, which was this extra white, extra bleached paper. And in the production of this particular paper type, there was a product called Sonox, which was a major chemical component in the bleaching of this paper. So this Sonox was released into the Cherokee River. There was a variety of analyses done just at the plant, slightly downstream at the plant, across the river on the other side. And these analyses that had been done, these water analysis, indicated that there was an increase in Sonox in the Cherokee River below where the Cardell factory producing this paper was. So one of the individuals at Cardell did a lot of research and analysis, wrote a big long document on it, went to the CEO and said, hey, look, we have noticed that there is an increased level of Sonox in the Cherokee River. We've received reports, not officially, but we've received reports that local doctors in the area are seeing an increase in a variety of different health conditions that had previously not been seen. And that we think that we potentially, Cardell paper is impacting the health of some of the residents. And I think that we should do something about it. And I think some of these things that we could do is, changing our wastewater treatment. We could adjust the plant and how the plant operates, and then we wouldn't be discharging this chemical into the river. But the problem with the proposal as it stood is it required almost a year of downtime for almost like part of the facility, a major part of the facility. So the hit to the balance sheet wasn't advisable. And so the CEO at the time went to the board, and they decided to adopt a wait and see method. That there was, potentially some regulations coming, and they should wait and see what those regulations look like. And, we don't really want to take a hit to the balance sheet. If we have to, we'll updo it, we'll fix it. But, we don't want to go and do it preemptively if we don't really have to. So the actions of a single employee highlighted the risks, provided some potentials and solutions. However, the financial considerations from the board and the CEO were quite significant at the time. And so they chose to adopt that wait and see method. So I'd like to hear from everyone here on the webinar to hear, so maybe we want to start off with what type of risk do you think Cardell paper is facing most prominently? Do you think it's a political risk, an economic, social, technical, environmental, or legal risk? Why don't we start there and see if there's any takers? Chase?
Yeah, so if anyone's just drop those in the chat function part there, I can read those off. Thanks. So our first one just came in: environmental, legal, and social.
Yes, bang on. So yeah, and obviously environmental, they're discharging the toxic waste into a river. Legal, likelihood of an impending legal action as a result of toxic waste into the river. And social, yeah, they're absolutely impacting people's lives now. So bang on. So the individual that we had talked about, the employee, did some analysis. what types of analysis or assessment methods do you think would be the best in this particular case? Qualitative or quantitative? Root cause? Hazard identification? Exposure assessment? Or consequence analysis?
Once again, anyone can drop those in the chat function there and I can read them off.
Thanks, Chase.
So Aaron responded saying quantitative exposure assessment and consequence analysis.
Yeah, those are two great ones to start with. Yeah, absolutely. So exposure assessment, you know, this is what it was, this is what it is now, the exposure of this item within the environment. And consequence, yeah, we're seeing this uptick, and it's potentially linked to the water. And you know, if it's gone up 14%, if these types of illnesses have gone up 14% in the last you know, measurable period of time, they can correlate that. So that's bang on. That's a great job.
We also had two people come
The
in
next
with
one is
some of the other people came in with hazard identification, hazard assessments, implementation of monitoring to verify the outside info.
Yeah, all very good. And here's where you really want to use a combination of risk assessment methods. You want to use probably two. In this particular case, you probably want to use 2 or 3. So really good. So risk management strategies. So we've got under risk management strategies, we can mitigate our risk. So this is a preventative measure. We can transfer risk, or we can accept the risk. And where do you think we should start in this particular instance, understanding this pollution risk? Do we think we should start with mitigating the risk, transferring the risk, or just accepting the risk? And if you could add why you think that.
Aaron said mitigation because transferring is a bad idea.
Mm-hmm. And what they're currently doing is already acceptance of the risk, right?
And yet Musa just said accepting the risk.
That's what they're currently doing. That's right. And we're just going to go out on a limb and say they didn't bother talking to the community or engaging any of the stakeholders, you know, in the releasing of the SONOX into the Cherokee River. Does anyone have any thoughts around what they think the CEO or the board should have done? Anyone think that there might have been somewhere between, you know, shutting a plant off and spending millions of dollars and doing nothing? Does anyone think that there might be something in the middle that they could have done?
Someone had an answer here a little bit earlier saying mitigating the risk in order to address potential lawsuits or convictions.
Yeah, so they could have potentially, you know, done some secondary filtration maybe on their discharge line, or you know, tanked some of it, or done something with the wastewater other than just straight pipe out into the river, right? So there's probably some sort of water treatment that could have been done with that wastewater before it went into the river, not shutting down a whole plant, but some sort of, you know, maybe in between measure, right? So that's an excellent comment.
Someone else said
so the next case study that I'd like to talk about, oh sorry,
2 more
go
answers
ahead,
here.
Chase.
Just want to get those off for you. One's an environment impact assessment
Okay.
of the effect of the Cherokee water, and someone else said engage the stakeholders as they mitigate the pollution.
Yes, very good. Very good. And so also to communicating with their stakeholders that they reckon, like the community, and saying, hey, look, we recognize there's a problem here. We've heard about these things. We're trying to come up with a solution. then the community's gonna be like, they care about us. They're trying, they're making an effort, they're recognizing that there's an issue and they're working towards a solution, right? So that engagement of trying to do something and find a solution and saying, hey, we recognize that there's a problem here and we're trying actively to resolve it. It creates a very different dynamic with your community and really helps minimize some of the fallout that occurs. I'm sure we've all seen Aaron Brockovich, right? You know, if you ignore the water problems too long, it turns into a class action. So I think that those are all good points. Unless anyone has any other comments, I'm going to move over to the Ford Pinto case. Oh, we're going to go back one. So I don't know if anyone remembers the Ford Pinto. I know when I was a kid, I think I rode in one once or twice. So what happened with the Ford Pinto is that they had their engineering design on the US manufactured Pintos had these brackets where these bolts stuck out, and in a rear end collision, the fuel tank hit those bolts and ruptured the fuel tank. And when that happens in an accident situation, it usually resulted in a fire or for sure discharge of fuel, and in many instances resulted in a loss of life, so that people would burn in the car. So not super great, obviously, and very tragic. So there was a group of engineers for Ford that were tasked with figuring out what was happening with the Ford Pinto. And so they went and they did a cost analysis, and they said, well, we figure it's going to cost us, it's going to be, X number of vehicles. This many people are going to die. This many people are going to be injured. The average, legal costs for paying out a family for a dead person, paying out family for an injured person, just sort of general damages and everything. And they came up with a number. They came up with I don't know, 14 million or something. And they're like, yeah, if we change out, or if we fix this, we're going to have to put this little rubber sleeve on these bolts, and that's going to cost us like $11. And when we look at the math, put the sleeve on, recall, put the sleeve on is going to be like $20 million. But to just pay this stuff out based on our analysis, it's only like $14 million. So why would we spend an extra $6 million just to make these things safe? And what the engineers, and I'll ask you guys what you think they missed. We'll go back to that same sort of methodology. So when the engineers were doing their analysis and they based it purely on cost, what were they missing? So that's your first question. So the interesting thing, though, is that the group of vehicles that were made in Canada and in Europe, exact same Ford Pinto, didn't do that. So in Canada, they put a sleeve on it, and in Europe, they moved the bolts so that there was no impact. They just put them in a different spot. So the US was the one that really struggled with making a different decision, and they viewed it strictly from a cost perspective of doing the only thing that they could think of, which was putting a rubber sleeve on it. So what happened fast forward is it was discovered that Ford knew about it. They didn't do anything. And there is this huge outcry from the public and from the government in the US. And they said, this isn't okay. You can't burn people in vehicles. You need to do better. And so the pending class action lawsuits, input from the government, everything else like that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, not 14, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so Ford had a ginormous financial impact and reputational impact as a result of failing to make a good decision here, or making a decision purely on financials. So I'm going to take you back again to types of risk. So they reviewed the financial portion of the risk, but what other risks were they missing? Political, economic, social, technical, environmental, and legal. Anyone in the chat yet, Chase?
Yeah, someone just responded saying social and legal risks, and then someone else replied the exact same thing as well. Someone else said
Great.
social risks because they would impact their brand, political and social.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually you have almost all types of risk here, because you have political, because now what happened is you ended up with more stringent vehicle requirements levied by the US government around safety, because they do it themselves. So now you have the government stepping in and mandating it. That's never really a good idea. Economic, we already talked about that, huge financial impact. Social, absolutely, brand reputation, loyalty to the brand, those types of things. Technical here, it seems maybe like, is it really technical? But they only considered one option. So I think that their inability to see beyond only one solution was a technical risk as well. They didn't innovate. They didn't, oh, we can just move the bolts, or we could do something that doesn't necessarily cost more money. The other thing in terms of in the technical space is the engineers actually didn't understand how much it was actually going to cost to put the sleeve on. So they way overestimated the $11 for the sleeve. It was actually more like $4. So the technical piece was also big in there, because there was no innovation done. There was no collaboration or brainstorming with other areas, like maybe Canada or the UK, who came up with other options. So I think that's also a risk in here. The only reason I'm going to say environmental is because when you have fuel in vehicles blowing up or burning, that's a discharge to the environment. And then those vehicles then obviously you have to recycle the metal, hopefully, but the rest of the items within the vehicle will just be put into the landfill. And legal, absolutely legal. Lots of lawsuits, class action and otherwise, for them to work through. So I think this one is a great one, because I do believe it actually touches on pretty much all aspects of risk. Any questions about that? Great. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the risk assessment methods. So can I ask you guys, like, why did they only focus on cost, or what other things could they have focused on? So in their risk assessment method, too many S's today, they only considered money. They only considered the total cost to fix the item, do a recall, fix the item, and they just compared that off of basic current case law, and didn't consider any other factor in the cost of what brand loyalty reduction looks like, or anything else. Our risk assessment methods of qualitative and quantitative, root cause, etc. The risk assessment methods would be good to use here. Excuse me. Chase, do you have
Yeah,
anything in the chat yet?
nothing coming up yet. They're still there. We're seeing right now just the what type of risks they were in the back there, but nothing new popping in there yet. If anyone wants to drop anything in there, that'd be great.
Okay, so some of the risk assessment methods you might want to do here, when we get into qualitative and quantitative, this is you can actually measure brand loss, and there is a way to turn that into qualitative, right? You have to look at the soft things that you might lose. So brand reputation is a loss, but if you lose, even 10% of your current consumers, and your average margin on your Pinto, say, was $400 back in the day, and you have 100 million customers, or 200 million customers for the Ford brand, You can do some pretty simple math in terms of what that looks like. Back then maybe it was only 10 million customers for that particular brand type. But it's really important that you take some of the soft pieces like brand and you figure out a way to make that mean something. Because I believe if you put some of those soft items and you figure out ways to analyze that appropriately, it changes the narrative a bit. And for organizations that are too focused on numbers and financials, it's a good way to highlight that risk for them. So the other one that they might want to consider is a root cause, and the root cause is going to lead back to engineering and the design and the safety within the design. It's tough. Now it's a lot easier because there's so much regulation around safety and components and the crash testing that has to be done and all that kind of stuff. It wasn't as prevalent back then, and you can see how the government has stepped in with certain rules around our vehicles for our own safety, because in a lot of instances the manufacturers didn't do it themselves. And so the risk assessment methods in terms of root cause and qualitative versus quantitative would be some really great ways to start here. So now I'd like to see if you guys have some risk management strategies that you would employ. So risk mitigation, so preventative measures. So that's, like we kind of talked about that just now, engineering. So risk mitigation, risk transfer. Is there any risk to transfer out in this particular case? And then risk acceptance. Does anyone have any thoughts around risk management strategy might be in this particular case instead of do nothing? What do you think a good option would be? Chase, anyone typing in the chat there?
Nothing coming up right now. I know sometimes takes a little bit for them to pop up. Stephen messaged before just after
No
saying
worries.
root cause could have been used to reduce the engineering mistake leading to vehicles being designed that way, which you mentioned as well. So yeah, I think they're just lagging a little bit on
Yeah,
coming
okay.
up with response. If anyone wants to drop anything in the chat there, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, sometimes there's a bit of a lag on these, and I think the Wi-Fi is a little taxed today with all the snow. Yeah, so for risk management strategies, one of the things that we probably want to do is we want to mitigate. So in this particular instance, mitigation is actually quite easy and simple. So a simple redesign or a simple sleeve, or maybe there's another alternative they hadn't thought of yet, but they didn't take the time to figure out some risk mitigation strategies. In terms of risk transfer, there really isn't a lot that they can transfer off other than to their insurance company to cover off the lawsuits, but that's likely not going to occur. And then they just accepted the risk. It was like, yeah, things blow up. It's going to be, we'll figure it out. And so that's not really what you want in this particular case. So in the Ford case, I think looking at the risk mitigation strategies and doing a deeper dive in terms of like a brainstorm with, maybe technical people and other individuals to really figure out how they're going to mitigate that particular bolt hitting the gas tank and causing fire and injury and or death. If they could come up with some other solutions, and the rubber sleeve and the moving the bolts might not be the only two options. Maybe there's 5 more options, who knows? But the thing is, they didn't take the time to effectively apply any risk mitigation strategies to the ones in the US. Europe and Canada did, which was great, but for whatever reason, Ford US just didn't think that was going to be a priority. So the other thing too, with the Ford case, which gets sort of really highlighted, is the community engagement. So Ford actually went, in this particular case, was almost anti-community. So almost like secretive and, that's not my problem. We'll just, we'll just deal with it at the lawsuit level. So that stakeholder and community engagement or like active avoidance of it was really problematic and to their brand and to their ability to recover. So it took Ford a really long time to get through this whole Pinto incident. Conversely, I don't know if you guys remember with the Toyota, there was a Toyota problem. I believe it was the Corolla or the Honda or something like that, and the mat would get stuck under the accelerator, and it would cause the accelerator to stick, and so people would ended up crashing their cars. If you hit the brake, it was fine, but if you didn't, if you just took your foot off the gas pedal would get stuck. And so Toyota took it very seriously, and they shipped everyone, or dealt with the mats themselves. And the reason is people would put a rubber mat over the cloth mat underneath, or the rug mat, and that's what would cause it to stick. So they would put stickers on it and say, do not put this rubber mat on top of the other rug mat, only use one mat at a time. It can cause pedal issues. And they took a really proactive approach. They communicated with everyone who owned their vehicle. They shipped mats to the different dealerships and stuff like that to be distributed. The CEO came to the US, spoke to his consumers and said, I take this very seriously. This is my brand, this is my company, this is my family. This is going to be fixed. I will make it right. And so when you look at those two in quite stark contrast, you have, somebody who's taking, a fairly minor, the mat gets stuck, but it was causing people to crash their cars very seriously, versus knowing that you have something that's exploding and choosing that it's not worth the time or the money. So it just really illustrates how different companies do things differently, and it depends on their risk appetite. So if they're willing to accept a lot of risk or uncertainty, and those types of things. So that's it for the two cases. I'm just going to turn it over to you guys on the call here. Does anyone have any additional questions, or did anything want anything more elaborate, or anything else like that? Any questions on either of the two cases? Back here.
I have one there for you. For the Ford Pinto case, what do you think would have been the best approach for US to take on that problem?
Oh, that's a really good question. So in the Ford case, one of the problems is they only had 2 engineers working on the problem with the gas tank. They didn't expand it to anyone in their marketing group or branding group, operational group, service group, or anything else like that. And so if they had a collaborative approach to say, hey, we have a problem, and they brought in a cross-functional team of maybe 3 or 4 different departments, including the engineers, I think they could have come up with a far better approach to solve the problem with a bit more of a holistic risk review. A really good question.
I have one here. As a small business, how can I mitigate risk associates with the event happening internationally?
That's a great question. So depending on the type of international risk, there's different things. So for example, if it's like a banking risk, you're going to rely on your different financial laws depending on the country. So for example, Europe's got some really great financial requirements. So you want to be really familiar with those. Depending on the jurisdiction, you'll want to find out what some of the local regulations are, and rely on your subject matter experts in that area to help you with some advice. So most, I know you're a small business, but most of any international countries, say for example, will have a commerce group that will help you with any sort of business setup, you know, pitfalls, concerns, things like that. So for example, in Calgary, we have the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. If you're not sure where to start, I would recommend Incoterms. So that whole group, which is the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC, they developed Incoterms, which are our standard shipping terms, but within there, they have a whole bunch of experts, legal, accounting, etc. otherwise, that can help guide you through different international rules, regulations, laws, and different things like that. So I believe if you go to the ICC website, you can get some more details there.
I have one here from Claude saying, not a question, just a short comment. Thanks for sharing that holistic view of managing risk. In addition to financials, perceived brand value, customers' perception, long-term and short-term issues related to the operations, best practices, and lessons learned. Community engagement is also key.
I agree. Great comment.
I think that is all for questions. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that myself. But yeah, if anyone wants to go back and watch any of this or take any questions, the webinar will be sent out to everyone within 24 hours. Just reminder of that. And stay tuned for any more of our upcoming events. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it, Stephanie.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye. Have a great rest of your day.
See ya.
Really enjoyed your participation. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.